Imagine a child born out of wedlock in a small Tuscan village, a boy whose illegitimate birth denied him the formal education his half-brothers would receive, who could never attend university, who could never become a doctor or lawyer or notary like his father, a boy who wrote backwards, whose mind wandered, who seemed to learn everything except what his teachers wanted him to learn. Now picture that same child becoming the most celebrated artist of his age, painting images so powerful they would be revered for 5 centuries. Picture him dissecting corpses in secret, mapping the human body with precision that would not be matched for 300 years. Picture him designing flying machines, tanks, and helicopters centuries before the technology existed to build them. Picture him studying water, light, mathematics, anatomy, botany, geology, engineering, architecture, and a dozen other fields with equal obsessive intensity. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, a man who embodied the Renaissance itself, the illegitimate son who dined with kings, the apprentice who surpassed his master, the artist who left most of his paintings unfinished, yet created images that define Western art, the scientist who conducted experiments no one would understand for centuries, the engineer whose designs were too advanced for his own time, the dreamer who wanted nothing less than to understand everything, to see how the universe worked, to capture in art and science the totality of human experience. His name is synonymous with genius itself. The Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in the world, shows us a woman whose smile we still try to decode. The Last Supper, covering the wall of a Milan monastery, depicts Christ's final meal with his disciples in a composition so perfect it has been copied thousands of times. The Vitruvian Man, that image of human proportions inscribed in circle and square, appears in medical textbooks, art books, and anywhere human potential is celebrated. But Leonardo was so much more than an artist. He was a scientist before the word scientist existed. He was an engineer designing weapons and water systems and city plans. He was an anatomist who understood the human body better than any physician of his time. He was a botanist, a mathematician, a musician, and a philosopher. He filled notebooks with tens of thousands of pages of observations, drawings, ideas, and questions. Most of these notebooks were lost. What survives is only a fraction of his total output, perhaps 1/4. And yet that fraction is enough to establish Leonardo as perhaps the most curious human being who ever lived. Before we begin, please like and subscribe if you don't want to miss future stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And now let us travel back to 15th century Tuscany, to a world of city-states and artistic revolution, of merchant princes and wandering artists, to a small village called Vinci, where on a spring evening in 1452, a child was born who would see the world differently than anyone before or since. The Tuscany of 1452 was a landscape of spectacular beauty and constant violence. The rolling hills covered with vineyards and olive groves, the cypress trees standing like dark sentinels along the roads. The fortified hilltop towns with their towers and walls spoke of both prosperity and danger. This was the Italian Renaissance, an era of artistic flowering and brutal politics, of magnificent art and casual murder, of humanism and warfare, existing side by side. Italy was not a unified nation, but a patchwork of city-states, kingdoms, and papal territories, each competing for wealth, territory, and influence. Venice dominated the eastern trade routes. Milan controlled the north with military might. Rome held spiritual authority through the Pope. And Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, was the banking and artistic centre where the Medici family wielded power through wealth rather than noble birth. The political situation was constantly shifting. Alliances were made and broken. Wars erupted over trade routes, territorial claims, or personal insults. Assassination was a common political tool. Poisoning was an art form. Mercenary armies fought for whichever state paid most. It was a world where brilliance and brutality walked hand in hand. Yet out of this chaos came an extraordinary flowering of human creativity. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, saw a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman learning. Ancient texts were rediscovered, translated, studied. The humanist movement emphasized human potential and individual achievement rather than purely religious concerns. Artists began to sign their works, to be celebrated as individuals rather than anonymous craftsmen. The invention of movable type printing around 1450 was revolutionizing the spread of knowledge. Books, once rare and expensive manuscripts copied by hand, were becoming more available. Ideas could spread faster than ever before. The old medieval certainties were crumbling, and new ways of understanding the world were emerging. Into this world of transformation, of old traditions giving way to new possibilities, Leonardo da Vinci was born on April 15th, 1452, in a small stone house in the hills above the village of Vinci, about 20 miles west of Florence. The house still stands today, a humble structure far removed from the palaces and studios where Leonardo would spend his later life. His mother was Caterina, a young woman about whom we know frustratingly little. She was probably a peasant girl from the area, perhaps an orphan, certainly poor. Some modern historians suggest she may have been a slave from the Middle East, though the evidence is unclear. What is certain is that she was not married to Leonardo's father, and in the rigid social hierarchy of Renaissance Italy, this mattered enormously. His father was Ser Piero da Vinci, a 25-year-old notary from a family of notaries. Sir was not a name but a title, indicating his professional status. The Da Vinci simply meant from Vinci, their ancestral village. Piero was ambitious, building a successful practice in Florence, on his way to becoming wealthy and respected. He would marry 4 times and father 12 legitimate children. But Leonardo, his firstborn, could never be legitimized. Under the laws and customs of the time, illegitimate children could not inherit their father's profession. Leonardo could never become a notary. He could not attend university. He could not enter the learned professions. The doors that would open automatically for his later legitimate half-brothers were closed to him. This accident of birth would shape Leonardo's entire life. It forced him toward the manual arts, toward work with his hands, toward painting and sculpture and engineering rather than law and letters. In a strange way, his illegitimacy freed him. Not bound by the traditional educational system, his mind could wander where it wished. He would teach himself, learn from observation rather than from books, trust his eyes more than ancient authorities. His illegitimate birth also meant that for the first 5 years of his life, Leonardo lived with his mother Caterina in the countryside around Vinci. These early years, surrounded by the natural world, would profoundly influence him. The hills and valleys of Tuscany, the flowing streams, the way light fell through olive leaves, the flight of birds, the growth of plants, all of this sank deep into his consciousness. Later, when Piero married a woman named Albiera di Giovanni Amadori, a 16-year-old girl from a good Florentine family, the arrangement changed. The marriage produced no children, and so young Leonardo was brought into the household, to be raised as part of the family, though always marked by his irregular birth. He lived in his father's house in Vinci, later in their residence in Florence. But he was not quite fully a son. His relationship with his father would always be complicated, marked by distance and formality. Piero provided for him, arranged for his training, helped him secure commissions. But there was never real warmth between them, never the easy affection that would exist between Piero and his legitimate children. Leonardo's childhood in the Tuscan countryside gave him something precious, though, a direct connection to nature that would inform all his later work. He was not confined to a classroom, memorizing Latin grammar and rhetorical forms. Instead, he was free to explore the hills, to watch animals, to observe water flowing over stones, to see how plants grew and how shadows fell. He learned to see, really see, with an intensity that few people ever achieve. Later he would write that the painter must learn everything about everything, must understand anatomy, botany, geology, mathematics, optics, and more. This commitment to observation over received wisdom began in those early years wandering the countryside around Vinci. By the time Leonardo was a teenager, it was clear he had artistic talent. The story is told, though it may be apocryphal, that Ser Piero showed some of his son's drawings to Andrea del Verrocchio, the leading artist in Florence. Verrocchio was so impressed that he agreed to take Leonardo as an apprentice. Whether the story is true or not, the fact is that around 1466, when Leonardo was 14, he entered Verrocchio's workshop in Florence. This was the conventional path for artists in Renaissance Italy. Art was not learned in schools but in workshops, through apprenticeship to a master. A boy would join a master's bottega, his workshop, and would learn by doing. He would start with menial tasks, grinding pigments, preparing panels, cleaning brushes. Gradually, he would be allowed to work on less important parts of paintings, perhaps a background landscape or a minor figure. If he showed talent, he would eventually be trusted with more significant work. The workshop system was intensely practical. Apprentices learned by observation and imitation, by copying the master's works, by gradual progression from simple to complex tasks. It produced highly skilled craftsmen who understood their materials intimately, who knew how to prepare a panel, mix paint to the right consistency, apply gold leaf, create the brilliant colours that Renaissance patrons demanded. Verrocchio's workshop was one of the best in Florence. Andrea del Verrocchio, whose name means true eye, was a goldsmith, painter, and sculptor who ran a busy studio producing altarpieces, sculptures, decorative work, whatever his wealthy patrons commissioned. His workshop was a place of constant activity, with multiple projects underway simultaneously, apprentices and assistants at different levels of skill, all working under the master's supervision. Here, Leonardo learned the fundamentals of art. He learned to draw, endlessly drawing, because drawing was the foundation of everything. Renaissance artists believed that accurate drawing was essential, that you had to understand the underlying structure of what you were depicting before you could paint it successfully. Leonardo would become perhaps the greatest draftsman who ever lived. But it began with countless hours of practice in Verrocchio's workshop. He learned to prepare painting surfaces, the meticulous process of applying layers of gesso to wooden panels to create a smooth white surface for painting. He learned to make paint, grinding minerals and plant materials into fine powder and mixing them with binding medium, usually egg yolk for tempera painting. He learned the chemistry of pigments, which colours were stable, which would fade, which were poisonous to work with. He learned to mix colours, to understand how they interacted, how to create flesh tones and subtle gradations. He learned composition, how to arrange figures in space, how to direct the viewer's eye, how to tell a story visually. He learned perspective, the mathematical system for creating the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. This was relatively new in art. The method of linear perspective had been codified by Filippo Brunelleschi only a few decades earlier, and Renaissance artists were still exploring its possibilities. Leonardo would push perspective further than anyone before him, not just the geometric perspective of architecture, but atmospheric perspective, the way distant objects appear hazier and bluer. He learned sculpture, working in Verrocchio's sculpture studio, where bronze casting and marble carving were practiced. Though Leonardo would never be primarily a sculptor, this training taught him to think three-dimensionally, to understand form in the round. It also taught him anatomy, because to depict the human figure convincingly, whether in paint or bronze, you had to understand the muscles and bones beneath the skin. But Leonardo was not a typical apprentice. Yes, he learned the traditional skills, but he was constantly asking questions that went beyond the immediate practical needs of the workshop. Why does the sky change colour at the horizon? How does the eye actually see? What makes some faces beautiful and others not? How do muscles attach to bones? How does water flow? These were not questions a painter needed to answer to produce an acceptable altarpiece. But Leonardo needed to understand, needed to know why, not just how. The other apprentices in Verrocchio's workshop included several who would themselves become successful artists. Pietro Perugino, who would later teach Raphael, trained there. Lorenzo di Credi worked alongside Leonardo. Domenico Ghirlandaio may have passed through. It was a competitive environment, with young artists vying to impress the master and win better assignments. Leonardo stood out, not just for his talent, but for his beauty. Contemporary accounts describe him as extraordinarily handsome, tall and strong with graceful bearing. He had long hair, unusual for the time, and he dressed well, even elegantly. He was charming, a good conversationalist, and he could sing and play the lira da braccio, a stringed instrument. He cut a striking figure in Florence, and people noticed him. By around 1472, when Leonardo was 20, he had completed his apprenticeship and qualified as a master in the Painters' Guild of Florence. He could legally accept commissions on his own, but he continued to work in Verrocchio's shop for several more years. The workshop system meant that many paintings were collaborative efforts. The master would design the composition, sometimes execute the most important parts, but leave other sections to assistants. The whole work would then be sold under the master's name. One painting from this period illuminates the relationship between teacher and student. The Baptism of Christ, painted around 1475, was primarily Verrocchio's work. But according to an early biographer, Verrocchio asked his young apprentice Leonardo to paint one of the angels. The story goes that when Verrocchio saw the angel Leonardo had painted, he was so struck by its superiority to his own work that he gave up painting forever, devoting himself thereafter to sculpture. The story is probably exaggerated. Verrocchio did focus more on sculpture in his later years, but not because of any dramatic revelation. Still, there's truth in the tale. Looking at the baptism today, Leonardo's angel is immediately recognizable. It has a softness, a three-dimensionality, a liveliness that the other figures lack. The angel seems alive in a way the rest of the painting does not. Leonardo had surpassed his master. For the next several years, Leonardo lived in Florence, accepting commissions, though often not completing them. This would be a pattern throughout his life. He would start a painting with enthusiasm, work on it intensely for a while, then get distracted by something else, or lose interest, or decide the work was not meeting his own impossibly high standards. He left far more works unfinished than finished. His first known independent commission came in 1478. The Signoria of Florence, the city government, commissioned an altarpiece to hang in the chapel of the Palazzo Vecchio. This was a significant opportunity. Leonardo began work, but he never finished it. Around the same time, Leonardo was living independently, maintaining his own household. A legal document from 1476 names him among several young men accused of sodomy. Homosexual activity was illegal in Florence, technically punishable by death, though in practice the authorities usually imposed fines or brief imprisonment. The charge against Leonardo was dropped due to lack of evidence, but it was raised again 2 months later and dropped again. Whether Leonardo was guilty, whether he had male lovers, whether he was homosexual or bisexual, or simply the victim of false accusation, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Leonardo never married, never had known female lovers, and throughout his life was surrounded by beautiful young male assistants and apprentices whom he treated with extraordinary generosity. His sexuality has been debated by historians for centuries. What seems clear is that Leonardo did not fit the conventional patterns of masculine behavior in Renaissance Italy. In 1481, Leonardo received a major commission that should have established his reputation. The monks of San Donato a Scopeto, a monastery outside Florence, commissioned an adoration of the Magi, a large altarpiece depicting the three wise men presenting gifts to the infant Jesus. This was a traditional subject, one that every major artist tackled. Leonardo threw himself into the project. His preparatory drawings show an incredibly complex composition, with dozens of figures arranged in dynamic poses, architectural ruins in the background, horses rearing, the wise men kneeling in homage, the Holy Family at the centre. It was to be his masterpiece, the painting that would announce his arrival as a major artist. He worked on it for several months, creating an elaborate underdrawing directly on the wooden panel, establishing the composition and beginning to build up the forms. And then he abandoned it. He left Florence for Milan, leaving the adoration unfinished. The monks eventually commissioned another artist to create their altarpiece. Leonardo's adoration, just an underdrawing and some areas of blocked-in paint, remained with him for years before being left behind. It survives today in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, a tantalizing glimpse of what might have been. Why did Leonardo leave Florence at this point in his career? He was 30 years old, established, receiving good commissions. What pulled him to Milan? The answer was ambition and opportunity. Florence in the 1480s, for all its artistic glory, was becoming artistically conservative. The Medici family, unofficial rulers of Florence, favoured a certain classical, elegant style. New ideas were not always welcome. Leonardo's experimental approach, his slow-working method, his tendency not to finish paintings, may have made him seem unreliable to potential patrons. Milan, by contrast, was ruled by Ludovico Sforza, called Il Moro, the Moor, because of his dark complexion. Ludovico was not born to rule. He was the younger son, but through political manoeuvring and force of personality, he had made himself the de facto ruler of Milan, one of the richest and most powerful cities in Italy. Ludovico was a patron of the arts, but he was more interested in practical applications than pure aesthetics. He needed military engineers, architects, urban planners, inventors. Milan was constantly threatened by hostile neighbours, constantly preparing for war. A man who could design fortifications, weapons and military devices would be valuable. Leonardo wrote a letter to Ludovico. This letter survives, and it reveals Leonardo's self-assessment and his priorities. The letter is extraordinary. Leonardo presents himself primarily as a military engineer. He lists 10 skills he possesses. 9 of them are about military or civil engineering. He can build portable bridges, can drain moats, can build covered vehicles that can break through enemy lines, can design catapults and other siege engines, can construct underground passages, can build ships, can design buildings. Only at the very end does he mention, almost as an afterthought, that he can also paint and sculpt as well as anyone. Whether this letter was what convinced Ludovico or whether Leonardo had other connections, the fact is that around 1482, Leonardo moved to Milan. He would remain there for nearly 17 years, the longest period he would spend in any single place. These would be among his most productive years. In Milan, Leonardo entered the service of Ludovico Sforza as a court artist and engineer. This was a different kind of position than he had held in Florence. He was now essentially a salaried employee, expected to be available for whatever projects Ludovico required. Sometimes this meant military engineering, designing fortifications or weapons. Sometimes it meant creating pageants and theatrical productions for court festivals. Sometimes it meant painting portraits or altarpieces. And sometimes it meant theoretical work, thinking about problems of mathematics or engineering or natural philosophy. Leonardo loved the variety. His mind craved stimulation, new problems to solve, new areas to explore. Milan gave him the resources and freedom to pursue knowledge in multiple directions simultaneously. The court of Ludovico Sforza was a place of sophistication and culture, despite the constant undercurrent of political intrigue and military preparedness. Ludovico cultivated intellectuals, artists, and engineers, creating an environment where ideas could flourish. The court attracted scholars from across Italy and beyond. There were debates about philosophy, demonstrations of new inventions, musical performances, elaborate theatrical productions. Leonardo thrived in this environment. His notebooks from the Milan period show him attending lectures, participating in discussions, corresponding with mathematicians and engineers. He was no longer just an artist, but a recognized intellectual, someone whose opinions were sought on a wide range of subjects. One area where Leonardo made significant theoretical contributions was the study of proportion and geometry. He worked with the mathematician Luca Pacioli, who came to Milan in the 1490s. Pacioli was writing a treatise on mathematical proportion called De Divina Proportione, and Leonardo created the illustrations, beautiful geometric drawings showing the 5 regular solids and their properties. The collaboration between artist and mathematician was fruitful for both. Leonardo learned advanced mathematics, while Pacioli gained insight into visual representation of mathematical concepts. Leonardo's interest in geometry was not purely abstract. He saw mathematical relationships everywhere in nature. The spiral of a nautilus shell followed mathematical principles. The arrangement of seeds in a sunflower head showed numerical patterns. The proportions of the human body reflected harmonic relationships. Understanding these mathematical principles was, for Leonardo, part of understanding the fundamental order of the universe. He filled notebook pages with geometric diagrams, working through problems of area and volume, investigating how shapes could be transformed while maintaining certain properties. He was particularly interested in the quadrature of the circle, the ancient problem of constructing a square with the same area as a given circle using only compass and straight edge. This problem would eventually be proven impossible, but Leonardo didn't know that. He attacked it with determination, filling pages with attempts at solutions. His approach was both mathematical and intuitive. He would try various geometric constructions, test them, find where they failed, try again. It was the same method he used in painting or anatomy or any other field. Observe, hypothesize, test, revise. Another significant area of investigation during the Milan years was optics and the science of vision. How do we see? How does light behave? How does the eye work? These questions fascinated Leonardo because they were fundamental to painting. An artist needed to understand how light creates the appearance of form, how colours are perceived, how distance affects what we see. Leonardo studied shadows, noting how they change depending on the light source, how there is always a range of shadow from darkest to lightest, how reflected light fills in shadows. He observed that shadows are never completely black in nature because light bouncing off other surfaces illuminates them. This was important for painting. The old, flat medieval style had used solid colours with little modelling. Leonardo's style used subtle gradations of light and shadow to create the illusion of 3-dimensional form. He studied the eye itself, dissecting animal eyes to understand their structure. He traced the optic nerve to the brain. He theorized about how the eye processes the light it receives, though his theories were limited by the knowledge available in his time. He believed correctly that the eye works somewhat like a camera, with light entering through the pupil and forming an image. He was wrong about some details, but his approach of empirical investigation, rather than accepting ancient authorities, was sound. He investigated perspective not just as a geometric system, but as a perceptual phenomenon. Linear perspective, which had been mathematized by earlier artists like Brunelleschi and Alberti, handled the geometric relationships of objects in space. But Leonardo went further. He observed that distant objects don't just appear smaller, they also appear hazier and bluer. This is atmospheric perspective, caused by light scattering in the atmosphere. The farther away something is, the more air you're looking through, and the more the light is scattered. Leonardo was the first artist to systematically understand and apply atmospheric perspective, and it became one of the hallmarks of his style. His landscapes fade into bluish mists, creating a sense of infinite depth. Leonardo's theatrical work for the Milanese court deserves more attention than it usually receives. He designed sets and costumes for elaborate productions staged for diplomatic occasions, weddings, and other celebrations. These were multimedia spectacles combining music, drama, dance, and amazing stage effects. Leonardo designed mechanical devices to create special effects. Flying angels descended from the ceiling on hidden wires. Mountains split open to reveal interior scenes. Celestial spheres rotated, showing the movement of planets. None of these productions survive except in descriptions and Leonardo's preparatory sketches. But they were important in several ways. They gave Leonardo experience with mechanics and engineering, creating a device that would reliably work during a performance, that could be operated by stagehands, that wouldn't break down at a crucial moment, required practical engineering skill. The theatrical work also kept Leonardo thinking about motion, about how to create the illusion of movement, how to direct the audience's attention, how to tell a story visually. These concerns translated directly into his painting. His compositions became more dynamic, his figures more active, his scenes more narrative. The theatrical productions also enhanced Leonardo's reputation at court. A successful production reflected well on Ludovico, demonstrating his sophistication and wealth. Leonardo's ability to create spectacular effects made him valuable beyond his paintings. The court festivals were important political tools. When important visitors came to Milan, a dazzling theatrical production showed them that Ludovico's court was cultured, wealthy, and powerful. Leonardo was part of that political messaging, using art to project power. During these Milan years, Leonardo also studied military engineering seriously. The constant warfare between Italian city-states meant that effective fortifications and weapons could determine survival. Ludovico needed military expertise, and Leonardo provided it. Leonardo designed fortifications with innovative features. He understood that the new cannon technology was making old-style high walls vulnerable. Cannonballs could smash through vertical walls. Leonardo designed fortifications with low, thick walls set at angles to deflect cannonballs. He designed bastions that ejected from the main walls, allowing defenders to fire along the base of the walls to prevent attackers from approaching. He designed moats and obstacles to slow attacking forces. Many of his fortification designs show sophisticated understanding of military strategy and engineering principles. He designed weapons, some practical, some fantastical. Practical designs included improved cannons, multi-barreled guns that could fire in sequence for sustained firepower, and giant crossbows for siege warfare. More fantastical were his designs for covered vehicles, essentially early tanks that soldiers could shelter inside while approaching enemy positions. His drawing of an armoured vehicle shows a circular platform covered with an angled shell studded with cannons, powered by men inside turning cranks. It's an impressive design on paper, but it wouldn't have worked with the technology available. The weight would have been immense, the cranks would have required more men than could fit inside, and once the vehicle got stuck or broke down, it would have been helpless. Still, the concept shows Leonardo thinking about mechanized warfare centuries before it became reality. He also designed what might be called chemical weapons, proposals to create smoke or poison gas to drive defenders from fortifications. These designs are uncomfortable to modern readers. Leonardo the artist, the creator of beautiful paintings, was also Leonardo the military engineer, designing weapons of war. This contradiction is part of his complexity. He lived in a violent time, served violent rulers, and used his genius to make violence more effective. Yet he also wrote in his notebooks about his hatred of war, calling it bestial madness. He painted images of sublime beauty while designing instruments of death. He was, like all of us, capable of containing contradictions. During this period, Leonardo also began systematic studies of human anatomy. He had drawn human figures throughout his career, but around the 1490s, his approach became more scientific. He wanted to understand not just the external appearance, but the internal structure. How did muscles produce movement? How were bones articulated? How did organs function? To learn these things, he needed to dissect human bodies. This was difficult, but not impossible to arrange. Hospitals would sometimes allow dissections for educational purpose. Saint Leonardo gained access to bodies at hospitals in Florence and later in Rome. He dissected at night, working by candlelight, because bodies decomposed quickly, especially in warm weather. The smell must have been overpowering, the work physically and emotionally difficult. But Leonardo pursued it with characteristic intensity. His anatomical drawings are masterpieces of both art and science. He drew bones from multiple angles, showing how they fit together. He drew muscles in layers, showing how they overlay each other and how they attach to bones. He injected wax into blood vessels to see their paths through the body. He made cross-sections of the skull to show the cavities inside. He drew the heart, the lungs, the digestive system, the reproductive organs. He dissected pregnant women, study the development of the fetus, creating drawings of the fetus curled in the womb that are both scientifically accurate and deeply moving. One of his most important anatomical insights concerned the heart. Medieval medicine, based on the ancient Greek physician Galen, believed that blood moved back and forth in the vessels like a tide. Leonardo recognized that blood circulates. He didn't understand the complete circuit, which wouldn't be fully described until William Harvey's work in the 17th century. But Leonardo understood that the heart was a pump that pushed blood through the body, and he correctly described the function of the heart's valves. He also studied the muscles of the face, understanding how tiny muscles around the eyes and mouth create expressions. This knowledge informed his painting. When he painted a smile, he understood which muscles were contracting, how the skin moved over the underlying structure, why certain expressions look genuine while others seem false. This scientific understanding of anatomy gave his painted figures an unprecedented quality of life. They don't just look right, they seem to be alive, to have weight and structure and the possibility of movement. He gathered around him a household of assistants, apprentices, and servants. His studio became famous. Visitors would come to watch him work, to see his latest experiments, to discuss ideas. He was building a reputation not just as an artist, but as a thinker, an innovator, a man of wide-ranging genius. Leonardo's botanical studies during this period show the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all his work. He drew plants with scientific accuracy, noting not just their appearance but their structure and growth patterns. He observed how leaves arrange themselves around stems in spiral patterns to maximize exposure to sunlight. He noted how vines curl around supports, how roots spread through soil, how flowers attract insects for pollination. His plant drawings are botanically accurate enough to identify species, but they're also beautiful as works of art. He saw no contradiction between scientific accuracy and aesthetic beauty. Truth and beauty were, for Leonardo, aspects of the same reality. He studied trees extensively, understanding how their structure works. He recognized that the total cross-sectional area of all branches at any given height equals the cross-sectional area of the trunk below that height. This is actually correct. though Leonardo had no way to prove it mathematically. He simply observed many trees and recognized the pattern. He understood that trees grow by adding rings, and that you can determine a tree's age by counting rings in a cross-section of the trunk. He noted that wider rings correspond to years with more growth, narrow rings to difficult years. He was discovering principles of dendrochronology centuries before it became an established science. His interest in botany connected to his interest in painting. Landscapes required accurate depiction of plants. But as always with Leonardo, the practical need for artistic knowledge led to deeper scientific inquiry. He didn't just want to paint a tree convincingly. He wanted to understand how trees grew, why they took the forms they did, what principles governed their structure. Leonardo's engineering work during the Milan period was extensive and varied. Besides military fortifications and theatrical devices, he designed civil engineering projects. He drew plans for canal systems to improve navigation and irrigation. He designed locks to allow boats to travel between water levels, showing detailed understanding of how locks work. He designed dredging machines to deepen canals and pumps to remove water from construction sites. He studied the flow of water in rivers and canals, observing how water moves faster in deeper channels, how it creates eddies and whirlpools, how it erodes banks. He designed devices to measure water flow and to control it. His notebooks contain hundreds of drawings related to water, showing his obsession with this substance that he considered read the driving force of nature. Water was everywhere in Leonardo's thinking. It carved landscapes, nourished plants, powered mills, put out fires, sustained life. Understanding water was understanding a fundamental force of nature. He spent countless hours simply watching water flow, sketching the patterns it made, trying to understand the principles that governed its movement. His drawings of water are beautiful, capturing the swirling, turbulent motion with flowing lines. But they're also scientific studies, attempts to visualize and understand complex fluid dynamics. He observed that when water flows over an obstacle, it creates a characteristic wake pattern. He drew these patterns from many angles, trying to understand the three-dimensional form of the water's movement. He understood that water cannot be compressed, that it always seeks the lowest level, that it exerts pressure proportional to depth. These principles seem obvious now, but in Leonardo's time, they were not well understood. His empirical approach, trusting observation over theory, led him to correct understanding. Leonardo's investigation into the flight of birds and the possibility of human flight represents one of his most ambitious projects. He was convinced that if he could understand exactly how birds fly, he could design a machine that would allow humans to fly as well. He studied birds intensely, observing them in flight, dissecting their wings to understand the structure, analyzing the mechanics of wing movement. He recognized that birds don't simply flap their wings up and down, but that the wing movement is complex, with different parts of the wing moving differently, creating lift and propulsion. He made detailed drawings showing the bones, feathers, and muscles of bird wings. He noted how different birds have different wing shapes suited to their particular style of flight. Long, narrow wings for gliding, short, broad wings for maneuverability, pointed wings for speed. He understood that the air itself provides support, that a wing moving through air generates lift. This was sophisticated understanding for his time. He designed flying machines based on his bird studies. His most famous design is the ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings that a human operator would power by working pedals and levers. The drawings are beautiful and detailed, showing mechanical linkages that would translate human muscle power into wing motion. Would it have worked? Almost certainly not. The power-to-weight ratio would have been unfavorable. Human muscles cannot generate enough power relative to body weight to sustain flight by flapping. Birds have much higher power-to-weight ratios than humans, with enormous breast muscles relative to their body size and hollow bones that reduce weight. Leonardo's ornithopter, even if perfectly built, would have been too heavy and underpowered to fly. But Leonardo's instinct was correct, that flight was possible through understanding and applying natural principles. He just lacked the materials and power sources that would eventually make human flight practical. His other flying machine designs included a helicopter-like device with a spiral screw that would theoretically pull itself upward through the air when rotated rapidly, and a parachute that would allow safe descent from heights. Neither was built in his lifetime, but both show his vision of flight from multiple angles, trying to solve the problem through different approaches. In addition to specific machines, Leonardo filled his notebooks with observations about air itself. He understood that air has weight, that it provides resistance to movement, that it can be compressed and expanded. He recognized that wind is simply air in motion, and he designed instruments to measure wind speed and direction. His studies of air and flight connect to his studies of bird anatomy, his interest in mechanics, his understanding of proportion and weight. Everything in Leonardo's mind connected. Understanding one thing led to questions about related things, and soon he was investigating multiple topics simultaneously, seeing patterns and principles that connected across disciplines. Leonardo's work on architecture during the Milan years shows yet another dimension of his genius. He didn't design many buildings that were actually constructed, but his architectural drawings show innovative thinking about how cities and buildings could be organized. He proposed an ideal city design with multiple levels. At ground level would be canals for transporting goods and removing waste. Above that would be streets for pedestrians, with buildings opening onto these walkways. The design would separate dirty industrial activities from residential areas, provide running water to all buildings, and create a more hygienic urban environment. This was revolutionary thinking in an age when cities were chaotic, filthy, and disease-ridden. Leonardo was responding to the plague outbreaks that regularly devastated Italian cities. He understood that better sanitation could prevent disease, and he designed urban infrastructure to promote public health. His ideal city was never built. The cost would have been enormous, and the upheaval of moving existing populations and building entirely new urban systems was impractical. But the designs show Leonardo thinking systematically about urban problems and proposing solutions based on understanding of how disease spreads and how human activities could be organized more rationally. He also designed churches, favoring centrally planned buildings with domes. His drawings show variations on circular, octagonal, and cross-shaped plans, always with perfect geometrical proportions. These designs reflect Renaissance ideals of harmony and mathematical beauty. The circle was considered the perfect form, and a circular church represented the perfection of divine creation. Leonardo explored how domes could be supported, how to create the complex geometry of a building with multiple domes and subsidiary spaces, how to light such buildings. His architectural drawings are precise and beautiful, showing floor plans, elevations, sections, and three-dimensional views that demonstrate complete understanding of the buildings he was designing. One of his early projects in Milan was to design a massive bronze equestrian statue honoring Ludovico's father, Francesco Sforza. This was to be the largest bronze horse statue ever cast, a monument that would proclaim the power and glory of the Sforza family. Leonardo threw himself into the project with typical intensity. He studied horses, dissecting them to understand their anatomy, sketching them in every pose, analyzing their proportions. He designed a revolutionary casting technique that would allow such a massive statue to be cast in a single piece, something that had never been attempted. He created a full-size clay model, which amazed everyone who saw it. But the statue was never cast. The bronze that had been set aside for it was instead used to make cannons. Milan was under from France, and military necessity took precedence over artistic glory. The clay model stood in the courtyard of the Sforza castle for years until French soldiers used it for target practice when they conquered Milan in 1499. It was destroyed. Leonardo's greatest monument was never built, but the sketches remain, showing his deep understanding of equine anatomy and his ambitious engineering vision. During these Milan years, Leonardo was also painting, though slowly and with his usual reluctance to consider a work finished. He painted portraits of Ludovico's mistresses. He worked on altarpieces for Milan churches, and he began work on what would become one of the most famous paintings in the world, The Last Supper. The commission came from Ludovico, who wanted a scene of Christ's last meal with his disciples painted on the wall of the refectory, the dining hall of the monastery of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. This was a traditional subject. Refectories commonly had Last Supper paintings, so that monks eating their meals would remember Christ's final meal. But Leonardo's conception was revolutionary. Rather than depict a static scene with the apostles arranged symmetrically, Leonardo chose to capture a specific moment of drama. Christ has just announced that one of the disciples will betray him, and the apostles react with shock, denial, and confusion. Each figure shows a different emotional response. Some lean forward demanding to know who. Some pull back in horror. Judas, identifiable by the bag of silver he clutches, recoils. The composition is brilliant, with Christ at the center, framed by the window behind him, his hands spread in resignation, while on either side, the apostles form groups of 3, each group linked by gesture and expression. The perspective is perfectly calculated so that the painted room seems to extend the actual refectory, as if Christ and the apostles are dining in the same space as the monks. Leonardo worked on the Last Supper for about 3 years, from 1495 to 1498. His method was unconventional. Traditionally, wall paintings were done in fresco, applying paint to wet plaster, so that the paint becomes part of the wall itself. This required working quickly, finishing each section while the plaster was still wet. Leonardo hated being rushed. He wanted to work slowly, to think, to make changes. So he experimented with a new technique, applying paint to the dry wall using a mixture of tempera and oil. This allowed him to work at his own pace, to revise, to add subtle details. Unfortunately, it was a technical disaster. The paint began to deteriorate almost immediately. Within Leonardo's lifetime, the Last Supper was already flaking and fading. Over the centuries, it deteriorated further, damaged by humidity, wars, and misguided restoration attempts. Yet even in its ruined state, the power of the composition remains. The gestures, the expressions, the psychological insight, the way Leonardo captured 13 different personalities in a single frozen moment. All of this transcends the physical decay. The Last Supper has been copied countless times. Every depiction of the scene for the past 500 years owes something to Leonardo's vision. Even people who have never seen the original know the image, recognize the composition. It is as much a part of Western visual culture as any image ever created. While working on public commissions, Leonardo was also pursuing private investigations that fascinated him far more than painting. He was dissecting corpses. In Renaissance Italy, human dissection was difficult but not impossible. The church opposed it, but didn't absolutely forbid it. Medical schools conducted occasional dissections for teaching purposes. Artists sought to understand anatomy to improve their depictions of the human figure. But Leonardo went far beyond what any artist needed to know. He didn't just want to see where muscles attached. He wanted to understand how the whole system worked. He performed dissections in hospitals, working at night by candlelight, cutting into bodies that were often only hours old. He dissected more than 30 corpses during his lifetime, carefully documenting what he found. His anatomical drawings are extraordinary. Using his artist's eye and his scientist's curiosity, He depicted the human body with unprecedented accuracy. He drew the bones from multiple angles, showing how they articulated. He drew muscles, layer by layer, showing how they overlapped and how they produced motion. He injected wax into organs to understand their shape. He made glass models of organs to see their internal structure. He drew the heart, the lungs, the digestive system, the reproductive organs, the brain. He made discoveries that would not be rediscovered for centuries. He correctly depicted the way the heart's valves work. He understood that blood vessels harden with age, causing heart disease. He traced the nerves from the spine. He mapped the ventricles of the brain. His drawings of the fetus in the womb are heartbreakingly beautiful, showing the curled position, the umbilical cord, the protective membranes. He noted that the proportions of the fetus are different from those of a child or adult, with the head larger in relation to the body. None of this was ever published during his lifetime. Leonardo's anatomical work remained in his notebooks, seen by a few friends and assistants, but unknown to the medical profession. If he had published, he might have revolutionized medicine, but he didn't. The knowledge died with him, to be rediscovered slowly by others over the following centuries. Leonardo's notebooks from the Milan years show a mind ranging over every subject imaginable. He studied optics, how the eye sees, how light behaves. He studied water, how it flows, how it forms waves and whirlpools, how it erodes stone. He studied birds, how they fly, how their wings work. He designed flying machines based on his bird studies, devices with flapping wings that a human might operate, though the technology to make them work didn't exist. He studied mathematics, working on problems of geometry. He was particularly interested in proportions, in the relationships between parts of a whole. The famous Vitruvian Man drawing, showing a man inscribed in both a circle and a square, comes from this period, illustrating the proportions of the ideal human body according to the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. He studied botany, drawing plants with the same careful attention he gave to human anatomy. He observed how leaves arrange themselves around stems to capture maximum light. He noted how water moves through a plant from roots to leaves. He sketched landscapes, not due, sent as backgrounds for paintings, but as subjects in themselves. He was fascinated by geology, by how the earth had been shaped over time. Looking at fossils of sea creatures found in mountains, he concluded that these mountains must once have been underwater. This was a radical idea in an age when most people believed the earth was only a few thousand years old and unchanging since creation. He studied sound, light, heat, magnetism, trying to understand the fundamental forces of nature. He designed machines, hundreds of them, filling his notebooks with sketches of gears and levers and screws. He designed water pumps, sawmills, textile machines, war machines, flying machines, digging machines, machines for every purpose. Most were never built, but they show his understanding of mechanical principles and his vision of what might be possible. He wrote backwards, in mirror script, filling page after page with his distinctive left-handed writing. Why mirror script? Perhaps because as a left-hander, it was more natural, preventing his hand from smudging wet ink. Perhaps as a form of secrecy, though mirror writing is easily read with practice. Whatever the reason, thousands of pages survive in this distinctive script. The notebooks are a window into Leonardo's mind, jumping from subject to subject as his interest wandered. A study of water flow is followed by a sketch of a fortress design, followed by notes on painting technique, followed by a mathematical problem, followed by a grocery list. There's no organizing principle except Leonardo's own curiosity. He filled the pages with thoughts, observations, questions, reminders to himself. Buy a skull. Ask the wife of Biagio Crivelli how the capon hatches the hen's eggs. He wrote notes to himself to investigate certain problems. describe the tongue of the woodpecker and the jaw of a crocodile. Have Avicenna's work on the useful things translated. Get the master of arithmetic to show you how to square a triangle. He made to-do lists that show the range of his interests. Find a master of waterworks and get him to tell you how to repair a lock, a canal, and a mill in the Lombard manner. Ask Maestro Antonio how mortars are positioned on bastions by day or night. Ask Benedetto Portinari how people go on ice in Flanders. This was a mind that wanted to know everything, that saw connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena that could never be satisfied with surface explanations. If Leonardo wanted to paint water convincingly, he needed to understand how water actually behaved. If he wanted to paint the human figure, he needed to understand the skeleton and muscles and how they produced motion. If he wanted to design a flying machine, he needed to understand how birds fly. Everything connected. All knowledge was part of a unified whole. This holistic vision, this refusal to separate art from science, observation from imagination, theory from practice, was Leonardo's great innovation. He didn't think of himself as an artist, separate from an engineer, separate from a scientist. He was all of these simultaneously, and each area of study informed the others. His time in Milan was interrupted by turbulent politics. Ludovico Sforza's grip on power was always tenuous. He was not the legitimate duke, and his rule depended on political maneuvering and military strength. By the late 1490s, the political situation in Italy was deteriorating. The French king, Charles VIII, had invaded Italy in 1494, claiming Naples. Though he was eventually driven out, he had demonstrated that the Italian city-states were vulnerable to foreign invasion. His successor, Louis XII, claimed Milan itself, arguing that he had a hereditary right to the duchy through his grandmother. In 1499, French armies invaded. Ludovico fled. The French occupied Milan. Leonardo's patron and protector was gone. The clay model of the bronze horse was destroyed. 17 years of security and support evaporated. Leonardo was 50 years old, and he had to start over. He left Milan in December 1499, taking with him his notebooks, his drawings, and a few trusted assistants. He travelled first to Mantua, where he was received by Isabella d'Este, Marchioness of Mantua, and one of the great art patrons of the age. She begged him to paint her portrait. He made a preliminary drawing, a beautiful profile sketch that captured her strong personality. But he never painted the finished portrait, despite Isabella's persistent requests over many years. From Mantua, he went to Venice, arriving in March 1500. The Venetians, facing a Turkish threat, consulted him about defensive fortifications. He proposed an innovative system for flooding certain areas to stop an enemy advance. The Venetians were interested, but didn't implement his plans. After a few months, Leonardo returned to Florence, the city of his youth. He had been away for 18 years. Florence had changed. The political situation was unsettled. The Medici had been expelled in 1494, and the city was now a republic, but an unstable one, still finding its political footing. Artistically, Florence had changed too. A new generation of artists had emerged. Michelangelo, 25 years younger than Leonardo, was making a name for himself. He had just completed his David, the massive marble statue that would become the symbol of Florence. Michelangelo represented a different artistic vision than Leonardo, more sculptural, more focused on the heroic male nude, more interested in expressing raw power and emotion than Leonardo's subtle psychological insight. The two men disliked each other. Their personalities were opposite. Leonardo was elegant, charming, well-dressed, sociable. Michelangelo was rough, dirty from marble dust, antisocial, difficult. Leonardo worked slowly, often leaving paintings unfinished. Michelangelo worked with furious intensity, sleeping in his clothes, barely eating. Leonardo was interested in everything. Michelangelo was focused almost exclusively on the human figure. They clashed publicly on several occasions, exchanging insults, Once, when Leonardo was discussing Dante's poetry in a public square, someone suggested asking Michelangelo's opinion. Leonardo called out to the younger artist. Michelangelo, paranoid and defensive, thought he was being mocked and shouted back that Leonardo couldn't even finish a bronze horse. The insult cut deep because it was true. Despite their rivalry, Florence's rulers had an idea. They would pit the two greatest living artists against each other in a public competition. Each would paint a large battle scene on the walls of the council chamber in the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo was assigned the Battle of Anghiari, depicting a Florentine victory in 1440. Michelangelo was assigned the Battle of Cassina, showing another Florentine victory. Both artists prepared cartoons, the full-size preparatory drawings that would be transferred to the wall. Leonardo's cartoon showed cavalry soldiers in ferocious combat, fighting over a battle standard, horses and men entangled in violent action. His studies for this work show his deep understanding of both human and animal anatomy, as well as his interest in depicting extreme psychological states, rage, fear, determination. Michelangelo's cartoon showed soldiers surprised while bathing, leaping from the water and rushing to arm themselves. It was a showcase for his favorite subject, male nudes in dramatic poses. Neither battle scene was completed. Leonardo began painting his portion directly on the wall, but again experimented with technique rather than using traditional fresco. He wanted to work slowly, to blend colours on the wall as he could on a panel painting. He tried a new medium that was supposed to dry slowly. The experiment failed. The paint ran, colours mixed muddily. The image deteriorated even as he worked on it. After struggling with it for months, Leonardo abandoned the project. Michelangelo never even started painting. He was called to Rome by the Pope to work on other projects. The Battle of the Battle paintings ended with neither victor. The cartoons themselves became famous. Artists flocked to study them, to copy them, to learn from the master draftsman. But eventually both cartoons were lost, cut up for souvenirs, or simply destroyed by time. We know them now only through copies and preparatory sketches. During this return to Florence, Leonardo was also working on a portrait commission that would become the most famous painting in the world. A wealthy Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo commissioned Leonardo to paint a portrait of his wife, Lisa Gherardini. She was about 24 years old, the mother of 2 young children, when she sat for Leonardo. The portrait was to be a standard chest-up portrait such as wealthy Florentines, commissioned to commemorate marriages or important family events. Leonardo began the painting around 1503. He worked on it for years, and he never delivered it to the patron who commissioned it. Instead, he kept it with him for the rest of his life, continuing to work on it, refining it, unable or unwilling to consider it finished. We know this painting as the Mona Lisa, from the Italian Madonna Lisa, My Lady Lisa. The French call it La Joconde, a play on her married name. It shows Lisa from the waist up, her hands folded, her body turned slightly, her face looking directly at the viewer. She sits before a landscape of winding paths and distant mountains, a dreamlike background that seems to belong to no specific place. And she smiles, that enigmatic smile that has fascinated people for 500 years. What makes the Mona Lisa so special? Technically, Leonardo employed every innovation he had developed over decades of painting. He used sfumato, a technique of building up many thin layers of translucent paint to create soft transitions between colours and tones, eliminating harsh lines. The painting has no outlines. Forms emerge from shadow gradually, naturally, the way we actually see them. The modelling of Lisa's face is extraordinarily subtle. The play of light and shadow across her features creates a 3-dimensionality that makes her seem alive. Her hands, folded in the foreground, are painted with such delicate gradations of tone that you can sense the bones and tendons beneath the skin. The landscape behind her uses atmospheric perspective. Leonardo understood that distant objects appear hazier and bluer because we see them through more atmosphere. The mountains behind Lisa fade into blue mist. The winding path and the bridge seem infinitely far away, but technique alone doesn't explain the painting's power. There's something in Lisa's expression, in that slight smile, in her direct gaze, that engages us. She seems about to speak, or perhaps she's just heard something amusing, or perhaps she's thinking her own private thoughts. The smile is ambiguous, shifting depending on where you look. If you focus on her mouth, she seems more serious. If you look at her eyes, the smile becomes more pronounced. Leonardo understood that human expressions are complex, that we don't wear simple masks of emotion, but show mixed feelings, subtleties, depths. Lisa Gherardini looks out from the painting as a real person, not an idealized type, not a symbol, but an individual human being with her own inner life. This was revolutionary. Previous portraits had shown people as types, as representatives of their social position. Leonardo showed a person. The Mona Lisa has had an interesting history. Leonardo kept it with him when he left Florence in 1506, returning to Milan. He kept it when he moved to Rome in 1513. He kept it when he moved to France in 1516. After his death, the French king acquired it. It hung in the royal palaces, admired but not especially famous. Its reputation grew over the centuries, but it became truly world famous only in the 19th century, when Romantic writers and poets began to write about it, seeing in Lisa's smile all sorts of mysterious meanings. In 1911, the painting was stolen from the Louvre by an Italian handyman who believed it belonged in Italy. The theft made headlines worldwide. When the painting was recovered 2 years later, it was front-page news everywhere. The publicity made the Mona Lisa the most famous painting in the world, a status it has never relinquished. Today, it hangs behind bulletproof glass in the Louvre, seen by millions of visitors every year. Most spend only a few seconds looking at it, snapping a quick photo before moving on. The image has been reproduced so many times, in so many contexts, that it's hard to see it fresh. But the original, the actual panel Leonardo painted, still has the power to move people if they look carefully, if they ignore the crowds and the reproductions, and actually see what Leonardo saw when he looked at Lisa Gherardini, a human soul looking back at us across 5 centuries. In 1506, Leonardo received an invitation to return to Milan. The French were now in control of the city, and the French governor, Charles d'Amboise, wanted Leonardo's services. Officially, Leonardo was only supposed to spend a few months in Milan, returning to Florence to finish the Battle of Anghiari, but he kept extending his stay. Florence's government complained, demanding he return to complete his work. Leonardo ignored them. By 1508, he had effectively abandoned Florence again. Milan under French rule offered opportunities and patronage. Leonardo was in his mid-50s now, past the age when most artists did their best work. But his curiosity remained undiminished. If anything, his interests were becoming more theoretical, more abstract. He was less interested in producing finished paintings, and more interested in understanding fundamental principles. He studied water obsessively. He filled notebooks with observations of how water flows, how it creates vortices, how it erodes stone, how waves form and break. He designed canals and drainage systems. He proposed schemes to make rivers navigable, to control flooding, planned to irrigate fields. He studied the heart, recognizing that it was a muscle that pumped blood. He studied embryology, dissecting pregnant animals to understand how life develops. He studied astronomy, the movements of celestial bodies, though he left no major contributions in this field. He designed ideal cities, with wide streets for traffic, separate levels for pedestrians and carts, running water in all homes, systematic waste disposal. These were fantasies, designs that would never be built. but they show his vision of how human life could be organized more rationally. He continued to attract young assistants and students. One of these was Francesco Melzi, the son of a noble family, who joined Leonardo's household around 1506 when he was about 15. Melzi became Leonardo's closest companion in his later years, more like a son than a student. Another was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, called Salai, which means little devil. Salai entered Leonardo's household as a 10-year-old boy around 1490. He was beautiful, charming, and thoroughly untrustworthy. He stole from Leonardo repeatedly. He broke things. He caused endless problems. And Leonardo adored him. He kept Salai in his household for more than 25 years, paying his debts, buying him fine clothes, leaving him property in his will. The relationship between Leonardo and Salai has been much debated. Was Salai his lover? Possibly. Was he a surrogate son? Perhaps. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it was clearly important to Leonardo, who seemed unable or unwilling to send the troublesome young man away. In 1513, Leonardo moved to Rome. The Pope's brother, Giuliano de' Medici, offered him patronage and a residence in the Vatican. Leonardo was 61 years old. Rome was the artistic center of the world at that moment. The Pope, Leo X, a Medici, was a great patron. Michelangelo was there, painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Raphael was there, painting the Vatican apartments. It should have been a triumphant period for Leonardo, but it wasn't. He was too old, too out of step with the current fashion. Michelangelo's heroic, muscular style was what patrons wanted. Leonardo's subtle psychological approach seemed old-fashioned. He painted little in Rome. His notebooks from this period show continued investigations into geometry, optics, and anatomy, but no major paintings were begun or completed. He felt unappreciated, ignored. Younger artists received the major commissions, while he was given minor tasks or none at all. His health was declining. He had suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed his right hand. Since he was left-handed, he could still draw and write, but fine detailed painting was becoming difficult. He felt his powers waning. For a man who had spent his life pushing boundaries, exploring new ideas, old age was perhaps the cruelest fate. His mind remained sharp, but his body was failing. When Giuliano de' Medici died in 1516, Leonardo lost his patron and protector in Rome. At 64, he needed to find a new situation. The offer came from France. Francis I, the young French king, invited Leonardo to come to France as premier painter, architect, and engineer to the king. The position came with a generous salary and a comfortable house at Amboise, near the royal chateau on the Loire River. Leonardo accepted. In 1516, he crossed the Alps for the last time, leaving Italy forever. He brought with him a few trusted assistants, including the faithful Melzi, and he brought his notebooks, thousands of pages of drawings and observations. He also brought 3 paintings that he considered unfinished, still in need of work. The Mona Lisa, a painting of John the Baptist, and another painting called Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. In France, Leonardo was treated with great honor. Francis I revered him, called him like a father. The king visited him frequently, discussing art, science, philosophy. Leonardo was given a beautiful manor house, the Château du Clos-Luz, connected to the royal chateau by an underground passage so the king could visit whenever he wished. Leonardo's duties were light. He was not expected to produce work, merely to be available for consultation. He helped design court festivals. He drew up plans for a new palace and for canals to improve navigation. He continued his studies, working on problems of geometry and mechanics. But mostly, he was an honored elder, a living symbol of the Renaissance, feted and respected. His health continued to decline. The paralysis in his right hand worsened. Walking became difficult. By 1519, he was largely confined to his rooms, cared for by Melzi and his servants. He put his affairs in order, making a will that divided his property among his servants and assistants. To Melzi, he left his notebooks, his greatest treasure. On May 2nd, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at Clos-Luz. He was 67 years old. The legend arose, probably false, that he died in the arms of King Francis I, who was heartbroken at losing his beloved friend. The truth is probably more prosaic. Francis was elsewhere when Leonardo died, but the legend persists because it captures something true. Leonardo was honoured in France, as he had never quite been in Italy. He was buried in the church of Saint-Florentin in Amboise. The church was later destroyed during the French Revolution, and Leonardo's bones were lost. In the 19th century, bones found in the ruins were identified, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, as Leonardo's, and were reburied. Today, a tomb in the chapel of Saint-Hubert at Amboise is marked as Leonardo's resting place, but we cannot be certain these are actually his bones. Even in death, Leonardo remains somewhat mysterious. What Leonardo left behind was extraordinary, though much of it would not be appreciated for centuries. He left fewer than 20 completed paintings. Many had been started and abandoned. Several had deteriorated due to his experimental techniques, but the paintings that survived were masterpieces that would influence every artist who came after. The Last Supper, despite its ruined condition, remained a touchstone of artistic composition. Artists for centuries would study how Leonardo arranged the apostles, how he created depth through perspective, how he captured the psychological drama of the moment. The painting became so influential that it's difficult to imagine the scene depicted any other way. Every Last Supper painting, since Leonardo, owes something to his vision. The Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in the world. Its fame grew gradually over centuries, but by the 19th century, it had achieved iconic status. Writers and poets composed essays about Lisa's mysterious smile. Artists copied and parodied it. When it was stolen in 1911, the theft was international news, and its recovery 2 years later made it even more famous. Today, millions visit the Louvre each year specifically to see it, though most spend only seconds looking before taking a photo and moving on. The Virgin of the Rocks exists in 2 versions, one in the Louvre and one in the National Gallery in London. Both show Leonardo's mastery of light and shadow, with figures emerging from darkness, illuminated by soft light that seems to come from the paintings themselves. The rocky grotto setting allowed Leonardo to demonstrate his understanding of geology and how light behaves in enclosed spaces. The Lady with an Ermine, painted in Milan, shows Cecilia Gallerani, Ludovico Sforza's young mistress, holding an ermine, which was Ludovico's symbol. The portrait is remarkable for capturing movement, the moment when the sitter turns her head, as if responding to someone calling her name. Most portraits of the time showed static, frontal poses. Leonardo's portrait captures a living moment, and Cecilia seems about to speak. Each of Leonardo's paintings repaid close study. The more you looked, the more you saw. The subtle modelling of flesh tones, the precise rendering of hands, the atmospheric backgrounds, the psychological insight in the expressions all revealed Leonardo's absolute mastery of his craft. But paintings were only a small part of Leonardo's legacy. His notebooks, more than 7,000 pages surviving out of perhaps 30,000 originally written, contained a treasure trove of observations, ideas, and designs. The problem was that these notebooks were scattered and largely unpublished for centuries. After Leonardo's death, Melzi inherited the notebooks and preserved them carefully at his estate near Milan. Melzi understood their value and intended to organize and publish them. He made some progress, compiling Leonardo's notes on painting into a treatise. But the task was enormous. Leonardo's mirror writing had to be transcribed. His notes jumped from topic to topic with no organization. Different notebooks covered the same subjects, Creating a coherent published work from this mass of material was beyond Melzi's capabilities. When Melzi died in 1570, the collection passed to his son, who valued it less. Over the following decades, the notebooks were gradually dispersed. Some were sold to collectors, some were stolen by visitors allowed to examine them, some were lost through carelessness or neglect. By the 17th century, Leonardo's manuscripts were scattered across Europe, in various states of completeness, often with individual sheets removed and sold separately. Scholars who encountered them recognized their importance, but struggled to make sense of them. The mirror writing was difficult. The mixture of technical drawings and poetic observations was confusing. The sheer range of subjects covered, from anatomy to hydraulics to optics to military engineering, made it hard to categorize what Leonardo had been trying to achieve. Some collectors valued the notebooks primarily as curiosities, examples of the work of a famous Renaissance artist. They didn't recognize the scientific importance of the content. Others recognized that Leonardo had made important observations, but couldn't fully appreciate insights that were centuries ahead of contemporary understanding. Gradually, through the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars began seriously studying Leonardo's manuscripts. As science advanced, it became clear that Leonardo had anticipated many discoveries. His anatomical drawings were published and recognized as groundbreaking. His observations on geology, botany, and physics were analyzed. His engineering designs were studied and sometimes reconstructed to test whether they would work. The process of cataloguing and publishing Leonardo's manuscripts continued through the 20th century and continues today. New discoveries are still made. In 1967, 2 previously unknown Leonardo notebooks were discovered in the National Library of Spain, misfiled and forgotten for more than a century. These Madrid codices contained important material on mechanics and other subjects. The largest collection of Leonardo's writings is the Codex Atlanticus, housed in the Ambrosiana Library in Milan. It contains 1,119 pages covering every period of Leonardo's career and nearly every subject he studied. The name Codex Atlanticus refers to its large atlas-like format. It was assembled in the late 16th century from loose sheets and smaller notebooks, arranged somewhat randomly. Modern scholars have worked to determine the original sequence and dating of the pages. Other important collections include the notebooks in the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, which contain many of Leonardo's anatomical drawings. The Codex Leicester, which focuses on geology, astronomy, and the properties of water, was purchased by Bill Gates in 1994 for more than $30 million, making it the most expensive manuscript ever sold. The Codex on the Flight of Birds in the Royal Library of Turin contains Leonardo's most extensive studies of bird flight. Each collection reveals different aspects of Leonardo's investigations. Looking at them as a whole, a picture emerges of a mind that was simultaneously rigorous and imaginative, systematic and intuitive, focused and wandering. Leonardo would start investigating one question and be led to related questions, branching out into multiple fields, seeing connections that others missed. His notebooks also reveal his personality in ways that finished paintings do not. We see his sense of humor in sketches and jokes. We see his frustrations when experiments don't work out. We see his wonder at natural phenomena, his delight in solving a problem, his impatience with people who don't understand what he's trying to accomplish. We see shopping lists, reminders to himself, fragmentary thoughts. One famous passage shows Leonardo calculating his expenses and concluding that he's spent too much on clothes and dining out. He resolves to be more frugal. It's a moment of ordinary human concern from a man we tend to think of as superhuman. We also see his method of working. He would return to the same problems over years or even decades, making new observations, refining his understanding, never quite satisfied. He didn't work linearly from question to answer. He circled around problems, approaching from different angles, accumulating information, waiting for insight to emerge. This method produced deep understanding, but not always completed work. Many investigations remained open-ended, pages filled with observations, but no final conclusions. Leonardo was more interested in the process of discovery than in publishing results. He learned for his own satisfaction, to understand how things worked, not to impress others or establish priority for discoveries. This meant that much of his scientific work had no impact during his lifetime or for centuries after. Other people had to rediscover what he had learned. But it also meant that Leonardo was free to follow his curiosity wherever it led, unconstrained by the need to produce publishable results or defend his findings against critics. The influence Leonardo did have on art was immediate and lasting. His students and followers, the Leonardeschi, spread his techniques throughout northern Italy. Artists who had never met Leonardo still learned from his works, studying them, copying them, absorbing his innovations. His approach to composition, his use of light and shadow, his psychological insight in portraiture, his integration of figures and landscape, all became part of the standard artistic toolkit. By the late 16th century, Leonardo was universally recognized as one of the three greatest artists of the Renaissance, alongside Michelangelo and Raphael. These three represented different aspects of artistic genius. Michelangelo embodied raw power and sculptural form. Raphael represented classical harmony and grace. Leonardo stood for intellectual depth and scientific understanding applied to art. Later artists positioned themselves in relation to these three masters. The Baroque artists of the 17th century, with their dramatic lighting and emotional intensity, owed much to Leonardo's investigations of light and shadow and his depiction of psychological states. The 18th century artists, who valued precise observation and natural depiction, looked to Leonardo as a model of the artist-scientist who understood nature through careful study. The 19th century Romantics saw in Leonardo a tragic genius, a visionary ahead of his time, misunderstood and unappreciated. They identified with his struggles, his unfinished works, his sense of isolation. They made Leonardo into a symbol of the artist as outsider, as prophet crying in the wilderness. The 20th century recovered Leonardo the scientist and engineer. As technology advanced and science became more specialized, scholars could finally appreciate the depth of Leonardo's investigations. They could test his designs, verify his observations, place his work in historical context. Leonardo's scholarship became an academic industry, with specialists studying particular aspects of his work, conferences devoted to his legacy, endless publications analyzing every page of his notebooks. Today in the 21st century, Leonardo has become a global icon. His name and face are recognized worldwide. The Mona Lisa is probably the most reproduced image in history. Leonardo has been featured in countless books, films, documentaries, and fictional narratives. He appears in popular culture as the ultimate genius, the polymath who could do everything, the visionary who saw the future. This celebrity status has both benefits and drawbacks. It brings attention to Leonardo's real achievements, encouraging people to learn about Renaissance art and the history of science. But it also generates myths and exaggerations. Leonardo is credited with inventing everything from the bicycle to the submarine, most of which he never actually invented. Conspiracy theories attach to his paintings, seeing hidden codes and secret meanings that he never intended. The real Leonardo, complex and contradictory, sometimes gets lost beneath the legend. Yet stripping away the myths doesn't diminish Leonardo's actual achievements. What he really did was extraordinary enough. He painted masterpieces that have moved people for 5 centuries. He dissected corpses to understand anatomy and created drawings that advanced medical knowledge. He designed machines that anticipated later technology He studied nature with a careful, systematic approach that deserves to be called scientific. He thought deeply about how knowledge is acquired and validated, contributing to the development of empirical methodology. He inspired other artists, scientists, and thinkers through his example of curiosity and persistence. Perhaps most importantly, Leonardo demonstrated that it was possible to excel in multiple fields, that art and science were not opposed, but complementary ways of understanding reality. In an age of increasing specialization, when we're told to focus narrowly on a single field, Leonardo's example suggests an alternative. Maybe deep understanding in one area enhances rather than detracts from understanding in other areas. Maybe the boundaries between disciplines are less fixed than we assume. Maybe curiosity should be allowed to wander. The Mona Lisa became the most famous painting in the world. The Virgin of the Rocks, of which there are two versions, showed unprecedented understanding of light and atmosphere. The Lady with an Ermine, a portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, mistress of Ludovico Sforza, demonstrated his ability to capture personality and movement in a formal portrait. Each painting showed technical mastery and psychological insight that set new standards for art. But Leonardo's paintings were only a small part of his legacy. His notebooks, more than 7,000 pages surviving out of perhaps 30,000 originally written, contained a treasure trove of observations, ideas, and designs. The problem was that these notebooks were scattered and largely unpublished. After Leonardo's death, Melzi inherited them and preserved them carefully. But after Melzi's death in 1570, the collection was dispersed. Sheets and notebooks were sold, stolen, lost. They ended up in collections across Europe. Many have never been found. What survives is scattered across museums and libraries. The largest single collection, the Codex Atlanticus, is in Milan. The Codex Leicester, containing studies of water and light, was purchased by Bill Gates in 1994. Other notebooks are in the British Library, the Royal Library at Windsor Castle, the Louvre, and elsewhere. For centuries, these notebooks were studied only by a few scholars. Leonardo's mirror writing made them difficult to read. His mixture of technical drawing and poetic observation, jumping from topic to topic, made them challenging to understand. And much of what he described was so far ahead of his time that readers couldn't appreciate what they were seeing. 19th and 20th century scholars gradually catalogued and published the notebooks, revealing the full scope of Leonardo's genius. His anatomical drawings were recognized as groundbreaking, anticipating discoveries that wouldn't be made until centuries later. His engineering designs showed remarkable understanding of mechanical principles. His artistic theory influenced debates about painting and perception. His observations of nature proved him to be a careful, systematic observer whose work deserved to be called scientific, even though the modern concept of science didn't exist in his lifetime. The paradox of Leonardo is that this man who wanted to understand everything, who studied more fields than perhaps any other human in history, left so little completed work. He never published a book. His treatise on painting, compiled from his notebooks after his death, was influential, but it wasn't the systematic work he had envisioned. His anatomical studies remained unknown to doctors. His engineering designs were built by no one. Most of his paintings remained unfinished. He started more projects than he completed, designed more than he built, investigated more than he explained. Why? Why did this driven, brilliant man leave so much unfinished? Perhaps because his standards were impossibly high. Nothing ever quite matched his vision. Every painting, no matter how beautiful, fell short of what he imagined. Better to leave it unfinished than to complete it imperfectly. Perhaps because he was easily distracted. His curiosity pulled him in too many directions. While painting a portrait, he would become fascinated by the way light reflected in the subject's eyes, which would lead to studying optics, which would lead to studying the anatomy of the eye, which would lead to broader questions about vision and perception. And suddenly months had passed and the portrait was still unfinished. Perhaps because he had trouble with authority and patrons. He worked slowly, and patrons wanted results. He experimented with technique when patrons wanted tested methods. He pursued his own interests when patrons wanted him to focus on their commissions. This caused friction, lost commissions, frustrated relationships, perhaps because finishing something meant letting it go, and Leonardo was reluctant to let go. As long as a work remained unfinished, he could still improve it. Once delivered to a patron, it was beyond his control, frozen in whatever imperfect state he had left it. Better to keep working, always working, getting a little closer to perfection, even if perfection could never be reached. All of these factors probably played a role. Leonardo was a perfectionist working in imperfect circumstances, a visionary centuries ahead of his time, a man whose reach exceeded his grasp. He saw more than he could capture, understood more than he could express, imagined more than he could build. The tragedy is that so much of his genius died with him, locked in unpublished notebooks, unfinished paintings, unbuilt machines. But perhaps that's not entirely a tragedy. Perhaps the unfinished quality of Leonardo's work is part of its power. His paintings capture moments of becoming, not final states. His drawings suggest possibilities rather than declaring certainties. His notebooks invite us to join his process of discovery, to think along with him, to wonder what he would have concluded if he had lived long enough to follow every thread of inquiry. Leonardo's influence on art was immediate and lasting. His students and followers, called Leonardeschi, spread his techniques and style. His paintings were copied and studied. His artistic innovations, particularly in composition, perspective, and modelling of light and shadow, became standard practice. By the time of his death, he was recognized as one of the greatest artists who ever lived, ranked alongside Michelangelo and Raphael as the supreme masters of the Renaissance. His influence on science took longer to materialize because his scientific work remained mostly unknown for centuries. But once his notebooks were published and studied, scholars recognized that Leonardo had anticipated many later discoveries. His anatomical accuracy, his understanding of hydraulics, his observations in geology all showed a mind working in ways that we recognize as scientific. Observation, hypothesis, testing, drawing conclusions from evidence. He lacked the mathematical tools and theoretical frameworks that later scientists would develop. But his approach, his insistence on observation over authority, his systematic documentation, his willingness to test ideas, all of this was genuinely scientific in spirit. Today, Leonardo da Vinci is recognized as the ultimate Renaissance man, the ideal of someone who excels in multiple fields. His name is synonymous with genius. When we call someone a Leonardo, we mean they are brilliant, multi-talented, visionary. He has become a cultural icon, someone whose face and name are recognized worldwide even by people who know nothing about art history. Mona Lisa is perhaps the most parodied, reproduced, and referenced artwork in existence. It appears on coffee mugs, t-shirts, advertisements, cartoons. Everyone knows the image, even if they've never seen the original. Leonardo's flying machines, those beautiful drawings of ornithopters and helicopters sketched centuries before human flight was achieved, have captured popular imagination. He is often credited, incorrectly, with inventing the helicopter, the tank, the parachute, and many other devices. The truth is more nuanced. He designed devices based on principles that later inventors would use, but his designs usually wouldn't have worked with the technology available in his time. He anticipated ideas, but he didn't invent working devices. Still, the popular image of Leonardo as inventor genius persists, and it's not entirely wrong. He did envision possibilities that others of his time couldn't imagine. Numerous books, films, and television shows have featured Leonardo as a character. The Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown's thriller novel, made him central to a global conspiracy theory, mixing fact and fiction so thoroughly that many readers came away with wildly inaccurate ideas about Leonardo's life and beliefs. But the book's popularity and the successful film adaptation showed that Leonardo's name still has power to fascinate popular audiences more than 500 years after his death. Scientists and engineers have named awards, institutions, and projects after Leonardo. The Leonardo da Vinci World Award of Arts is given to outstanding artists. The Leonardo da Vinci International Airport serves Rome. Educational programs from elementary schools to universities use his name and image to represent interdisciplinary learning, creativity, and the integration of arts and sciences. But who was Leonardo beyond the legend? Strip away the mythology, the attributions of every Renaissance invention, the mystical interpretations, the conspiracy theories, and what remains? A man, born illegitimate in a small village, who taught himself to see the world with extraordinary clarity. A man whose mind could not rest, who had to understand how everything worked, who filled notebook after notebook with observations and questions and ideas. A man who loved beauty, who could spend years perfecting the curve of a smile in a portrait. A man who loved knowledge, who dissected corpses at night to understand human anatomy. A man who could design elegant machines, compose powerful paintings, play music, tell stories, charm wealthy patrons, yet who often felt misunderstood and underappreciated. A man who worked slowly, who often didn't finish what he started, who pursued perfection knowing it was unattainable. A man who surrounded himself with beautiful young assistants, who never married, who seemed to find his closest emotional connections with his students and companions. A man who moved from city to city, patron to patron, never quite finding a permanent home, always seeking the situation where he could pursue his interests freely. A man who in old age crossed the mountains into France, leaving behind his homeland to find honour in a foreign court. A man who died far from where he was born, his greatest work scattered and unfinished, yet who left behind images and ideas that would outlive him by centuries. Leonardo was not superhuman. He had weaknesses and limitations. He could be vain, concerned with his appearance and reputation. Contemporary accounts describe him spending considerable time on his clothing, favouring fine fabrics and elegant styles, even when working in his studio. He cared what people thought of him, how he was perceived by patrons and peers. This vanity was perhaps natural for someone who lived in a world where appearance and social standing mattered enormously, but it does humanize the genius, reminding us that he was subject to the same concerns about status and recognition that affect everyone. He could be calculating, playing patrons against each other to improve his position. When he left Florence for Milan, he did so partly because Milan offered better opportunities, but he left without finishing the adoration of the Magi, leaving the commissioning monks without the painting they had paid for. When he left Milan for Florence, he took paintings that arguably belonged to patrons who had commissioned them. His relationship with money was complicated. He earned well from his various positions but spent freely and was often in debt despite his income. He could be unreliable, promising work he wouldn't deliver. Patrons learned not to entirely trust his assurances about when a painting would be finished. The standard commission contract specified deadlines, but Leonardo routinely ignored them. This caused frustration and sometimes anger among those who had hired him, who needed the work for specific occasions or locations. His experimental techniques often failed, as with the Last Supper and the Battle of Anchiari, causing work to deteriorate even as he created it. A more practical artist would have used proven methods, but Leonardo insisted on experimenting, on trying new approaches, even when they didn't work reliably. This stubbornness resulted in the loss of works that might otherwise have survived. He could be critical and dismissive of other artists, particularly those whose approach differed from his own. His rivalry with Michelangelo was partly about genuine artistic differences, but it also involved ego and competition for commissions and recognition. Leonardo could be petty, making cutting remarks about competitors, highlighting their failures. He left people disappointed, left commissions unfulfilled, left promises broken. Assistants who expected him to secure them positions or advancement were sometimes let down. Patrons who commissioned specific works and received nothing or something quite different than requested had reason to feel cheated. His own illegitimate son, if the persistent rumors about his paternity were true, grew up without acknowledgement from his father. Leonardo was, in short, human. But he was human in a way that showed what human beings are capable of when curiosity is allowed to flourish, when observation is valued over authority, when the desire to understand drives every action. He lived in an age of transition, when the medieval worldview was giving way to a more modern sensibility, when artists were becoming respected as intellectuals rather than mere craftsmen, when the study of nature was beginning to be systematic rather than purely theological. Leonardo embodied this transition perfectly, standing at the intersection of old and new, medieval and modern, religious and secular, artistic and scientific. He had one foot in the medieval world of universal Christian meaning, and one foot in the modern world of individual observation and empirical investigation. He studied anatomy partly to make his paintings more accurate, a medieval justification, and partly because he simply wanted to know how bodies worked, a modern motivation. He drew landscapes as backdrops for religious paintings, but also because he was fascinated by geology and erosion, wanting to understand how the earth had been shaped over time. His flying machines were both artists' fantasies and serious engineering studies. Everything he did straddled the boundary between art and science, between imagination and observation, between medieval and modern. This is perhaps why he continues to fascinate us. He seems both familiar and alien. We recognize his curiosity, his systematic approach, his desire to understand. But we're also amazed by his range, by his willingness to pursue knowledge in so many different fields, by his refusal to specialize. In our age of specialization, where scientists focus on narrower and narrower areas of expertise, Leonardo's broad curiosity seems almost impossible. Could anyone today make significant contributions to art, anatomy, engineering, geology, botany, and hydraulics simultaneously? Probably not. The knowledge in each field has become too deep, too specialized. We can admire Leonardo's range, but we cannot imitate it. The world has changed too much, yet the spirit of Leonardo, the commitment to observation, the insistence on seeing for yourself rather than accepting authority, the integration of different ways of knowing, this spirit remains relevant. When scientists use visualization techniques to understand complex data, they are following Leonardo, who understood that drawing could be a tool for thinking, not just for recording. When designers use biomimicry, studying natural forms to solve engineering problems, they are following Leonardo, who studied bird flight to design flying machines. When educators argue for interdisciplinary approaches, connecting art and science, they are following Leonardo, who never saw these as separate domains. The notebooks that survive, those roughly 7,000 pages out of perhaps 30,000 originally filled, are a lasting monument to human curiosity. Page after page of observations, sketches, questions, ideas, covering every imaginable topic. The pages are beautiful as objects, even if you can't read the mirror script text. The way Leonardo integrated text and image, the way his sketches flow across the page, the variety of content from technological to artistic to purely fanciful, all of this makes the notebooks fascinating to look at, even for people who don't read Italian. They are windows into a mind that never stopped questioning, never stopped looking, never stopped trying to understand. In our age of distraction, of information overload, of attention divided among screens and notifications and competing demands, Leonardo's focused observation seems almost superhuman. He could sit and watch water flowing over rocks for hours, sketching the patterns, noting how the water moved, thinking about why it behaved this way, He could spend months on a single painting, adjusting tiny details that most viewers would never consciously notice. He could fill pages analysing how a muscle attached to a bone, working out the mechanics of motion. This kind of sustained attention, this depth of focus, is increasingly rare. We live in a world of superficial knowledge, of quick facts and easy answers. Leonardo represents something different, a commitment to really understanding, to going deep, to not being satisfied with surface explanations. Of course, this commitment came at a cost. Leonardo's depth meant leaving much unfinished. He couldn't be satisfied with good enough. He always wanted to go further, understand more deeply, capture more accurately. This perfectionism meant that many paintings remained forever in progress, that many ideas stayed as sketches rather than becoming finished treatises. He was perhaps too ambitious, trying to understand too much, refusing to accept the limits of a single lifetime. But that ambition, that refusal to accept limits, is also what makes him inspiring. He showed what one person could attempt, even if no one person could finish it all. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine Leonardo in his studio, candlelight flickering across a painting in progress. The Mona Lisa, perhaps. Not yet finished. Never to be finished, but a little closer to perfection than yesterday. Hard day. His hand moves slowly, adding another translucent layer of paint, adjusting a shadow, softening an edge. Outside the window, the Italian night is dark and quiet. The street below is empty. Everyone else is asleep. But Leonardo works on, patient, focused, pursuing a vision only he can see. Or imagine him in the dissecting room, the smell of death heavy in the air, cutting carefully into a corpse, exposing the muscles of the arm, seeing how they overlay each other, how they attach to bone, understanding suddenly how the mechanics of motion work. He sketches rapidly, recording what he sees before the body decays further. He is discovering something no one else has seen, understanding something no one else has understood. The knowledge may die with him, but in this moment, he knows, and thus, a knowing is enough. Or imagine him in his old age, in France, in the beautiful house the king has given him, sitting in his garden on a warm afternoon, unable to paint anymore, his right hand paralyzed, but his mind still sharp. Melzi reads to him from his old notebooks, and Leonardo remembers the observations, the questions, the endless curiosity of his younger self. Some questions were answered. Many were not. But he pursued them all, followed where curiosity led, tried to understand everything. No one can understand everything, not even Leonardo. But the trying, the reaching, the refusal to accept ignorance, this was a life well lived. His eyes grow heavy. The afternoon sun is warm. Melzi's voice continues, reading words Leonardo wrote decades ago. The words blur and fade. The questions remain, waiting for others to pursue, to answer, to ask new questions in turn. The cycle continues. Understanding grows. Leonardo's part is done. He can rest now, knowing he pushed human knowledge forward, left behind images that would inspire generations, demonstrated what one curious mind could attempt. The garden is peaceful. France is beautiful. He is far from home, but he is content. The work is never finished, but his part is done. He closes his eyes. The sun is warm. The voice reading his words grows distant. He drifts, finally, to rest. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Until next time, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Leonardo da Vinci painted the smile we still try to interpret. He drew the inventions we finally built. He dissected the bodies we finally understood. He asked the questions we are still trying to answer. The boy from Vinci, who could never go to university, became the teacher of everyone who came after. The illegitimate son, who could never inherit his father's profession, left an inheritance that belongs to all humanity. Good night.